Welcome to the Future of Sharing, this series where we're going deep on how can we make the sharing economy work for everyone. This series is done in partnership with Airbnb. My name is Pete Leiden. I'm the founder of Reinvent, the media company that's driving the conversations. And today we have interesting conversations coming in from Utrecht in Holland. Martijn Arets, he's an international expert in the field of scalable online platforms, you can think of it as. He spends a lot of his time roaming the globe, seeing how that manifests itself in different countries, different cities, and he's also doing some deep research on the next evolution of that, and particularly on platforms themselves. So it's great to have you here. Thanks for spending the time with us.
Yeah, welcome. Good to be here.
Yeah. So give us a little bit about what you do. Actually, I did my, I gave a little bit of an intro there, but explain kind of what you've been doing in this space and some of the places you've traveled to, and just give us a little more overview, and then we'll get into some specifics on those different regions.
Yeah, sure. My interest in platforms started in 2012. So what I did, then I quit my job. I was a marketing communication manager, and I followed my dream. So I was traveling in an old Volkswagen van through Europe to talk to the leaders of 20 big European brands under the name Brand Expedition. Then I wrote a book in Dutch, and I also wanted to have the English version. So then I did, as first in the world, an equity-based crowdfunding campaign to fund the translation, print, and design of my book. And it was for the outside world a big success because I was first in the world, but behind the scenes it was a mess. So also because I was first in the world, I also went as first in all the processes of the tech services and all these kind of nice institutions. So in the end, I lost about 100,000 euro in this project. But what I really saw, this crowdfunding, it got big potential, but there must change a lot behind the scenes before it could reach the maximum potential, but also before it will be a model where all the stakeholders get the right value out of it. So it would be a fair model. And then I thought, okay, but this crowdfunding is a platform that brings together demand and supply. So it's low thresholds, it creates trust between the stakeholders, and it facilitates the transaction. Then I thought, okay, but this is much bigger than only money on platforms. This is also staff, labor, and knowledge on platforms. So then I also came with the name Collaborative Economy. So it was still free, the URL, so that was good. And I said, okay, this is going to change every industry the next 10 years, but nobody knows how. So I decided to start a new expedition, but not in an old Volkswagen van, but just in a different way. And so the last 5.5 years, I've been traveling the world under the name of Crowd Expedition, and I did about 400 interviews in 13 countries, mostly in Europe, and of course also US and Israel, to talk to the leaders of the platforms, the experts, the policymakers, to really understand what is happening, why, who are the stakeholders involved, what's their agenda, what are the main dilemmas, and what are the main future scenarios. And so I've been doing this now for about 5.5 years. And 1 month ago, I also joined the Utrecht University to do part-time to researchers on platform co-ops, and also research on how platforms can contribute to a more inclusive society. So I really like to watch this development from different perspectives, because you can see it from a startup perspective. But if you only are going to look to the startups, then you have a complete wrong view of what's happening over here. So I'm also advising the city of Amsterdam how to deal with Airbnb. So then you really get to know about all the discussions of all the stakeholders, also stakeholders who are not directly involved in the platforms.
Fascinating. So, so what countries? You kind of mentioned a bunch of countries, but just literally, where have you been, or just as an overview, just to kind of understand what you've been sucking up and thinking about?
Yeah, physically. So in person, in of course Netherlands, Belgium, UK, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Italy, Spain. Even though I went to the Arctic Circle at a really nice crowdsourcing community, to Israel, and to the US, to San Francisco, and to New York. That's about it, I guess, and Iceland.
And so a lot of the European and kind of the range from south to north to very north, frankly, Did you find a lot of differentiation in kind of how people thought about the sharing economy platforms? I mean, was there a lot of differentiation in that case, or was it kind of a
Yes,
commonality
there is. I
coming
think
through?
in Europe you can split Europe in two halves, the upper and the lower half. So the Netherlands is together with the Nordics, so Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. They're quite far ahead on these developments. Well, the lower parts like Belgium, France, also Germany, and Spain, they're on a different level. So this is when you really look at the physical platforms or the online platforms. But when you look at the more, if you dive deeper into the sharing economy, also really the local communities, these things you really see in the south of Europe. So because like Spain, they're really famous about their cooperatives. So it depends if you're going to research the sharing economy from a online platform perspective, then the Nordics are really far ahead. When you look at the more social, really offline sharing economy, then I think you see much more in the southern part of Europe.
Okay. Well, let's go there in a minute here in terms of the differentiation, a little bit of difference going on here. But first, let's talk about how you think about the sharing economy. We've been looking at your things you've written and spoken about and things. You said you started your understanding of this space through crowdfunding. But then and you talk about collaborative economy, which I'm assuming is more of a overarching umbrella for various things. But you also talk specifically about the sharing economy, the gig economy. Because we find different people have different understandings of what all this is. And so I'm just curious, what is the way you explain the kind of differentiation between these things, and particularly with the lens on the sharing economy as well?
Yeah, so how I explain is, you could say the umbrella, that's the collaborative or platform economy. And these are the platforms that helps individuals to do transactions. And when it's about money, then it's crowdfunding. When it's about stuff, then it's sharing economy. And when it's about labor, then it's the gig economy. And also when you look at the development, it's also, and hardly anyone does this, but it's really interesting to see, like in Europe, first in 2011, crowdfunding started. Then 3 years later, sharing economy started, so stuff through platforms. And then 2 years later, so now the gig economy is starting to grow. And the interesting thing is that if you look at these three developments, you can also see parallels, because in the end, it's all about platform dynamics.
Interesting. Well, before we get into those parallels, so the overarching way you talk about it is the collaborative economy or the platform. You also said or the platform economy. So when you say platforms, I mean, in some ways you could say many of the leading tech companies in the world right now are platform companies. When you think of the collaborative economy, do you think of it as a subset of that, or would you say all platforms, it's really, you're talking about the platform economy? Meaning,
yeah, good question. Good question. I think in a way I'm researching it. It's a more a peer-to-peer economy or a business-to-peer economy. So platforms like so no media platforms like Facebook or Google or YouTube. So really to platforms where also I think you can describe it that there is in most of the times there is also a offline part of the transaction. And it's also interesting in the development of the sharing or platform economy is that the online dynamics we already knew from the Facebooks are now also converting to the offline worlds.
What do you mean? Say more about that. What do you mean by that?
Like with Facebook, it's all online, and of course it has a indirect impact on our lives, but in the end it's all about the online world. But with the collaborative economy platforms, there's also a offline elements in it. So like with Airbnb, you meet the people. With Uber, you meet the driver. So then the online dynamics we already seen for years in social media are now also projected to the offline world. And I think it's also one of the biggest I would say. And I think this is also one of the ways that most problems are starting right now, because when you have only a complete online company, then you can experiment everything you want. But at the moment that you're also tapping into the physical society, then you also have different stakeholders around the platform, like Airbnb. Their stakeholders are the platform, demand, and supply. But when you look at a society like the city of Amsterdam, a city has hundreds of stakeholders, and a platform has also impact at many of the stakeholders, and that's also where the friction starts.
I see what you're saying. So that you, but it's both similar. So what you're saying is some of the. So say a little bit more about that, because you're alluding to some of the problems that are coming on purely. Let's say Facebook is a good example, which is kind of purely happens in the world in terms of the actual day-to-day guts of what happens on Facebook. But you're saying now we're seeing with how that impacts the election in the United States and things like that, that there's issues now as it impacts the world, and that there's a similar set of kind of things that start online by a transaction between people to share a house or something that then impacts the neighborhood or the city that they're in. Is that what you're trying to say? Or explain to me what you mean by that. Why things that once were online are now migrating into these other environments?
Yeah. I think if you are in a complete online environment like Facebook, then you can play and experiment with all the algorithms, the data, to try to influence the behavior of the visitors. But so you have complete control of the environment. But with a collaborative economy platform, there's also a part of the environment you don't have control on. That's the real offline worlds. And that's the difference, I think, what's also happening, and also one of the ways that the challenges are there since they are right now, that we are having the online dynamics now also projecting on the offline worlds.
Interesting. And that's when you start to get into regulation, you start to get into controversies, and that's why what you're saying is the sharing economy part of this collaborative economy is, would you say, on the forefront of having to interact with cities, interact with regulation, interact with politics at some level? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and it's also interesting what City of Amsterdam did with Airbnb, because it's also a task of governments to learn from that and to learn how to anticipate on that. Because the platform economy we see right now, it isn't the end phase. So if you are now going to think about regulation, you don't need to close everything as it is right now, because we're still in a transition. But that's my opinion.
Well, we'll explain a little bit, because you said that you actually were advising the city of Amsterdam a little bit in this kind of how to think about Airbnb. Well, explain a little bit to folks that don't know what happened there. What was the story basically, and how did it evolve?
I think what's interesting with Airbnb in Amsterdam, in December 2014, they made an agreement. Amsterdam was the first city in the world who made an agreement with the city in Amsterdam, and they made regulation. So they said, okay, max of 60 days, max of 4 people. Not in social housing.
What do you mean? What do you mean not in social housing? Explain that.
I'll say it in English. So houses that are also partly subsidized by governments.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah.
So they made a limit on how many nights you could do it. A limit on how many people could be in that room or be in that dwelling, and then certain kinds were out of bounds. And,
yeah, that's right.
And that was a mutually agreeable arrangement, apparently, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that was also first not public, but later they published it in public. It was interesting because also in the agreement was also that they that made the agreement of not talking bad about each other. So that was quite a discussion here in the Netherlands. But what they did by starting work together with Airbnb from almost day one, they also were learning the city about how are we going to put a development of short stay rental from private houses into our city. And the biggest problem was it's really easy to think about regulation, But the biggest problem is how to maintain regulation, because they had an agreement, but the city has no access to the data, and this evolved in the next years in this agreement. So in the last agreement, Airbnb also programmed a cap of 60 days in the platform. And in the end, and that's very also interesting about the learning process of cities working together with platforms. In the end, last October, the city decided to start a new law that you need to register your house when you're renting out on Airbnb. Because in the end, of course, you can work together with platforms at a city, but in the end, you need a platform independence, maintain regulation strategy. Because maybe Airbnb wants to work with them together, but other platforms, they won't work together. So if you really want to maintain the regulations you make, you really need to think about, okay, how can we make a platform independent strategy? And that's what they're doing right now. And of course, Airbnb is not really happy with that. And I know why they're not happy.
They're not happy with that, you're saying?
No, because people now need to register on a website of the City of Amsterdam. And it's, of course, a new threshold for people to rent out their house. And what platforms do, they are lowering thresholds. So every new threshold that is there, that's for them has effect on their conversion.
But isn't there ways to do that? Because I know in other contexts, there's ways to streamline that process or make it more technologically seamless. And there are things. Is that happening in Amsterdam as well? The kind of, or is it a old kind of school sign-up process and things like that?
Yeah, it's not this old school because you can log in with your digital identity, but it's still it could be better. And that's also in discussion when you look at governments, because many governments, they're asking platforms to change for the best of the regulation. But you can also ask the question to government, okay, but how are you going to facilitate online platforms to tap into your into your government system? I think the best example in the world is Estonia. Estonia is a really small country in Europe, in the east. They have about 1.6 million inhabitants, and they are the most digital country in the world. So you can already vote online since 2009. So everything in the country from government happens digital. And what they are doing is they are really offering a platform as a government where others can tap into. Because what they say we as an Estonian government, we are the fastest government in the world based on technology. So we're 10 times faster than which other country in the world, but we're 10 times slower than which startup in the world. This will never change. So we accept it, and now we're building APIs for startups to tap into our platform of the governments and then facilitate others to grow. And that's, of course, a really unique scenario from a government, because I have no idea how it is in the US, but in the Netherlands, government and IT are not the really most popular combination.
Totally, yeah. Although that is starting to change, and because it's obvious in many respects that it has to evolve in that direction. So the question is, how do you do that? That's fascinating, the Estonian thing. But just to finish this experiment in Amsterdam, though, because it's an interesting test case. So you started early in the process. There was a certain kind of agreement. You went from, okay, there's certain limits, and then you realized, oh, there needs to be some kind of data sharing is the next kind of level that you had to figure out, so that each side understands what's really going on. And then the third stage, the way you described it, is you have to have some kind of registration, because if you had 60 nights in Airbnb, you could have 60 nights in or another VRBO or some of these competitors. And so from the city's point of view, you'd get around that regulation. So they're trying to figure out there has to be some way. But then the next evolution is to make that seamless or very easy, so that if someone does register, it's just Now, do you think once going through that whole process, once that gets refined, are most parties happy with that arrangement? And has that been seen as a positive thing, or has it been problematic and controversial in any way?
I think when we're in what you just described as phase 4, so that's future, that would be ideal for every stakeholder, because then I also think about the regulations about how to bring something positive to all the stakeholders. So like when you make the link with the registration process of the city on Airbnb or which other platform, then it's also a extra service for the users, because then they can see, okay, this is a certified house, so I can go there, and I don't have the possibility that somebody, some law officer comes into the house and kicks me out. So it's also is a added value of the trust issue of the platform. But that's the future scenario. I think for now, the first phase you described, it's too early to really say something about that, because they started only in October. So that's 1.5 months ago, and they're also experimenting. And what you also then see is that we users, we people, we citizens, we accept from startups that they are learning and failing. But when a government starts something in technology, it must be perfect at day one. It's also interesting to see the discussions, because of course that government with such a system will never be perfect at day one. But yeah, we as citizens, we expect from the government not to make mistakes, and we think it's okay when startups make mistakes.
Do you think that attitude is changing at all, or do you think that's a permanent fixture? I mean,
for now it's permanent, but maybe it's also something about the default distrust in government and IT. So maybe when the government proves that they can do it right, then this will change, but they need to earn it.
Interesting. Okay, so a good example there that was a really interesting example of Amsterdam and kind of what's happening in Holland. You mentioned Estonia as kind of state of the art, working perfectly, or as good as any place. And the cutting edge there is opening APIs into their governmental systems. Now, example, Airbnb and these other sharing economy companies, are they operating well there? And are things going well from what you understand in terms of the sharing economy up in Estonia?
Yeah, from Airbnb, I don't know, but what I know from Uber, it's working quite well. Also because they also have the data link for the drivers with the system, so that's also really easy to handle the tax issues and these kind of things. So in the end, because as a government, you can also think about, okay, how can we lower our own transaction costs as a government? And when you make smart connections with the outside world, you can also lower the transaction costs of the government. That's also in Estonia where it started, because Estonia first belongs to Russia, and then they separated a couple of years ago. And then they knew two things. First, we are just a small country, so when something happens, nobody knows who we are. So we need to find a way that the world knows who we are. Second one was, okay, we want to give our citizens a certain level of service, but when we are going to organize this traditionally, we will never be able to pay it, because we only have 1.6 billion or million people in our country. So then they decided, okay, we're going to put ICT as the USP of our country, because then the world knows who we are. So Skype is from Estonia, TransferWise is from Estonia. So some really big companies there from Estonia originally, and they could also lower the organization and transaction costs of the country, so they could offer a certain level of service to the people who are living in the country without the needs of paying the amount of money you need to pay as a traditional government.
So what you're saying is the positive side for the government as well as the sharing economy companies is it's easier to collect tax. You mentioned it briefly, but I just want to be clear on this. So it's easier to pay taxes. It's easier to understand who's making what. I mean, so just everybody, and then from the point of view of the taxi driver or the driver, they don't have to do all this filing differently. So in other words, what you're saying is all the stakeholders benefit from that kind of digitization.
Yeah. But but there's one but, because
okay.
All stakeholders they benefit as long as they want to play a fair game. And there are many people who are making much money in the sharing economy without declaring it to the taxes. That's also a pretty big problem, of course, for the tax services. Also, like with Airbnb, people are making lots of money with the platform, but at the end of the year, they need to declare it under tax issues. But yeah, I think most people, they don't do it. At the moment that all the systems are connected, then you have no other option. and then you need to pay 40% taxes on your Airbnb income. And I think many people really prefer to have the less transparent system.
Fascinating. That's interesting. Okay, well, let's get in our kind of global survey here, or kind of at least certainly the European survey. So you mentioned that there's two ways to think about the evolution of the sharing economy. The Northern Europe, now Estonia being part of Northern, Holland, part of Northern. Are there any other kind of things you want to bring out about what's interesting up there in the Northern kind of sphere of kind of evolution of the sharing economy? Other regulation areas of interest, other developments that are kind of ahead of the curve?
No, there are some small cases, but I think the adoption rate of technology is much bigger. Also in the UK, by the way, and also there's really good, like internet, like in Netherlands, we have a really good internet connection everywhere, also mobile. This also changes really lots by country. And of course, for the sharing economy, platform economy, you need to have good internet. But there are also some really interesting cases in the more southern part of Europe, where the more community and local way of life and thinking are really embedded into the sharing economy.
Well, so talk about that. Give us some more. Give us some ideas about that for people who don't really understand that differentiation. So you're saying that they're building off a history, maybe of a different kind of cultural history that's more conducive to it, or something, or say more.
Yeah, I think it's also changed. I think it also depends on which country or how involved people are in the discussion. Like Netherlands and Belgium. Belgium is on the south of Netherlands. In the northern part of Belgium, they speak even the same language as we are doing here in Netherlands. But when I'm in the sharing Facebook groups in Belgium, there's much more discussion. And in Netherlands, there is hardly any discussion. So what I really see in the more southern countries, they're much more engaged into the political system. They really have much more opinion. And we Dutch people, maybe life is too good for us. We think, oh, okay, it will be fine.
But say more about what's going on then in these southern countries, Spain, Italy, and that kind of stuff. What's different about the sharing economy down there? Say more about that.
I think the speed of the adoption is slower. I think, like in Netherlands, we're really good in being ahead of new technologies, but we're really bad in keeping this position after 3 years. And I really see that's also more southern countries, but also like the UK, they're much better in a much more long-term development of these platform technologies. But there are also some good examples from the southern parts. So like BlaBlaCar, it's a ride-sharing company. It's I think a $1.6 billion evaluation, and that's the only sharing economy unicorn in Europe, I guess. So that's quite big, also because there are really big distances. In Belgium, they are now experimenting with a sharing economy tax. So there maybe technology is a little behind, but they are experimenting. So I think it's really differences per country, what makes it unique and what make them fast and what make them slow.
When you say Belgium is experimenting with a tax for the sharing economy, is that what you said? Explain that a little bit more.
Yes, because in the end, everybody officially needs to pay taxes on your income on sharing economy, but it's really hard to check for the tax services, and it's also it's really hard to really see how much money you make because when I earn, let's say, €500 in January, next year, January, I know how much I need to pay in taxes because it's just with the complete tax system. And what they did, but they're also changing it right now, but what they experimented with was a sharing economy tax. So the platforms, they need to connect with the government, not on data, but on some agreements. And then everybody in Belgium could earn a max of €5,000. That's I think about $6,000 a year on these platforms, and then they need to pay through the platform a upfront tax of 10%. So the platform was the entity that collected the taxes upfront of the users, and it was quite special for a government experimenting with these kind of taxes.
How did it go? I mean, how is that experiment gone? Is it seen as a success or a problem, a controversy?
No, there were quite some platforms that connected, but also some of them that they didn't. But they're now changing it. Last thing I heard about it, they're just saying, okay, you can earn as a max of €6,000 a year tax-free. Because the problem is when you say, okay, you have a tax discount when you work into platforms, is that you are discriminating the way how you get the job. Like a cleaner, when a cleaner gets work through the platform, then you have a tax benefit. But if you have a via contact, like your neighbor, introduce yourself, then you pay a higher tax rate. And of course, that's also not something that works on long term.
Interesting. Now, in terms of the southern region, you made reference earlier that there seemed to be more activity around the cooperative movement side of things. So say more about that distinction and why that's happening there and what's actually happening there.
I think in the southern part, they're more used to really live in really tight communities. Maybe it's also has to do something with the more tight bonds with the family. I think in the more northern part, we're more individual lives, I guess, but I'm not a specialist at that. But my gut feeling is that in the southern part, it's also more about family, also taking care of your parents and your grandparents. So they're, I guess, more used to these local communities, and this also involves like with some more cooperatives. But there are also, of course, many cooperatives in other parts of Europe. But I think these family bonds and this local responsibility is really important in this, because in the end, the sharing economy, we're talking a lot about the global platforms, but with most sharing or gig economy platforms, the transaction is local. Airbnb is different because people come from different places in the world. But with most sharing economy platforms, the transaction is local. Like peer-to-peer car sharing. In the Netherlands, we have Snapcar, and it's also now expanded to the other European countries. And their ambition is to be the biggest peer-to-peer car sharing platform in Europe. But in the end, me as a user, I will never cycle for more than 5 minutes to get a shared car. So. And also, if you see how platforms grow, they grow from city by city or zip code by zip codes. So in the end, demand and supply, they are always living near each other. So the benefits of having a global platform is getting less a added value to smaller competition. And it's also why the smaller communities, I predict in the future, they can also build their own ecosystems.
Are you finding that that indigenous, localized platforms are indeed sprouting up, particularly in Europe and Southern Europe and places like that?
Not particularly Southern Europe, but in Europe and things I see slowly more and more local platforms. Because let's stick to the example of the peer-to-peer car sharing. So what does the platform add for value? They make the match of demand and supply, so that you can find each other. There's a reputation system, they have the booking system, and they have the insurance. What you see in the Netherlands, many big insurance companies, they were adapting the sharing economy on peer-to-peer car sharing. They learned from that, but of course they realized the biggest market is not on platforms, but are people who are sharing their cars with neighbors or with friends. And if they can sell them a on-demand for 1 day a car sharing insurance for €3 or €5 a day, that's a really big business. So now all the insurance companies, they're experimenting with with car sharing insurance for individuals, not through platforms. So the added value of the insurance will disappear from peer-to-peer car sharing platforms. The reputation system, there are slowly coming now some independent reputation platforms like Deemly in Denmark. So you don't need to have the reputation system of the the peer-to-peer car sharing platform. Because people are living together, it's also really easy to communicate by using WhatsApp or what other means. So the only added value of the platform will be the connection the first time of demand and supply. So many elements that used to be quite capital intensive or exclusive for platforms will go lower to the individual users. There's also, like in Finland, there's ShareTribe, and ShareTribe is a WordPress for marketplace software. So you can build your own Airbnb, very simple version, almost for free. And everybody, so you don't need to have any technical skills. So you just drop and experiment something on the website, and you can have such a website online in a day. And you only, because it's open source, so you only pay for the hosting services. So that's about €100 a month or something like that. So all the unique or cost-intensive elements of the sharing economy platforms, they will be lower, and this gives many opportunities for a more decentralized landscape of platforms. And this is really only for the platforms where demand and supply are really living close to each other, because then you also need to have the big network effect and critical mass, because you only need to have the people maybe in 1 or 2 square kilometer on your platform. And because the costs are really low, you also don't need to make much profits.
That's fascinating, interesting. Say more about that, the company in Denmark. You said Deemly. You said it was a reputation. Essentially, it's a generic reputation software that could be applied to any different simple startup. Or say more about it. I haven't heard about them.
Yes, they are.
What is it? What's
independent online reputation system.
What's the name again? Say it again. I missed the game.
Deemly.
Deemly. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But go ahead. Sorry. What do they do then?
So they have a independent reputation system. So you create a profile, and then you link some platforms that you are a member of to the profile of Deemly, and this one then imports your reputation data, and then creates a new reputation profile. And it's interesting because then in the end, you as a end user, you don't have a login on a platform because you can go to other platforms. The added value for new platforms is that every new user already has a reputation and rating. So then people will start interacting faster on the platform. And first I thought, okay, this is only interesting for new platforms because there's a problem of many users without any reputation, so nobody will start a transaction. Mm-hmm. But then I was talking to Nicola, one of the founders of BlaBlaCar, and he told me about the newbie effect. And because now many platforms, they are generating, they're having the users, and they're interacting a lot on the platform, so they're building up their reputation data and profiles. But then, when the second part of the wave comes into the sharing economy or the platform economy, then you have a complete new group without any reputation. So only the people with high reputation, they will get the jobs, and people with no reputation, they have a problem. So also for them, it's interesting to work together with such platforms because then you can avoid the newbie effect. And it was something that was really interesting.
That's fascinating. So in other words, a new person to BlaBlaCar, as an example, who might have a sterling reputation in other platforms, can't prove that because they're a newbie into BlaBlaCar. And so what that does is it overcompensates the early adopters because they're the only ones with the reputation. So when people want to go for the good reputation, they go to the early adopters, which then creates a network effect where those folks go through the roof, I suppose, compared to the new person. So that's a system problem in a way that, interesting, even the platforms that are well established want some kind of portable reputation system, essentially. Is that right?
Yeah, and of course, as a platform, you don't need to share all your data with the reputation system. You just can make agreements on, because like the fact that I am a good host on Airbnb doesn't mean that I am a good driver on Snapcar. So you can make some general reputation metrics that you can share with all the other platforms. So it's really hard to make it work, also as a business, But when it works fantastic. And then you can also use, and it's also already happening in other countries, you can also use these reputation systems also in other industries, like the financial industry. And there are many countries where people don't have a financial background. So if they want to have a loan, people don't know if they can trust this person. And these kind of reputation data can also, and it's also, of course, a story that all these platforms are telling their investors. That's also really a possible big added value for the financial industry. And with that, they can also open a complete new market.
It's fascinating. So, it's this thing, and I've been covering the tech world for over 20 years here, and it is interesting that every time you think you get to a problem that's very difficult to solve, there's always some kind of new technology that figures a way to kind of get around it in a way that's very positive. Because there is this kind of, you could argue, and a lot of people would argue, that one of the reasons you have these gargantuan global platforms is that there's a very high incentive to go to a trusted source like Airbnb or Uber as opposed to some new source. And one of the main reasons is that once you're in there, your reputation is established. There's very strong incentives to stay there rather than leave to another one. But so solving that portable reputation would be a critical development here to kind of spreading out or decentralizing platforms in a way. And but what's interesting,
and of course, you also need to ask yourself the question: how important will reputation systems be in the future?
We'll say, what do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, because normally we as individuals, we trust institutions. And it's like the last time you went flying in an airplane, did you check the rating of the pilot? Or did you check if the airplane had the right maintenance papers? I didn't. Because I trust the brand, the institution to handle everything. And I think reputations, they are really valuable because we're now doing new things on platforms. So we need an extra excuse to do it. And also reputation systems, they're for the platform really a really good thing because they're outsourcing their HR. Because they don't need to evaluate the driver, but the people will do. So it's really a smart way of getting rid of your HR departments. But in the end, like with Uber, I'm ordering an Uber because I trust the brand is maybe, but because I have trust in the brand of doing the job that it needs to do. So I trust the brand in doing the background checks with the drivers, kicking better drivers off the platform. So when I'm ordering an Uber, I order Uber because I trust the system and because it's really easy and cheap. And when I ordered the taxi, then I see the reputation of the driver. But yeah, there must be something really wrong for me to cancel the ride. So I don't think that reputations will disappear, but I think the role will change in the importance of the trust of the users, of the demand side of the platform, how important the reputation system will be in the future. For the platform, it's really important because they're outsourcing their HR. But really for the trust of the people in the platform, I think this also will be a reshift imbalance between the individual trust through reputation systems and the trust in the brand of the platform.
So you don't think the trust in brands will go away? You actually think it won't be like everyone will have a portable reputation and ultimately that's all we need to determine who we trust. You're saying there's still a really critical role for trusted brands to hold together the whole system at some level, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think also the reputation system that you can transfer to platforms, that will also help the brands and platforms to do a better screening. Because now when you look at the reputation system is so you start at the platform, and when you screw up, you kicked off. So it's a kind of a self-maintaining system. But the downside is, first somebody needs to screw up, and that's bad for the customers. So if you can cut this layer of people screwing up because you have no idea who they are and what the skills are, then you can really lower the quality of the platforms.
The one thing I did think about, I mean, have you seen in your travels or your surveys of mostly Europe there, is there any efforts of a public body, a government, of kind of establishing that independent reputation system or identity and reputation? Because that would be another way to do it. The system could also work by having that, and I do know in China, for example, we've been doing some work on China. China's now using these reputations to actually almost in a way that's actually problematic, because it's essentially going to allow them to rate all their citizens at some level. But anyhow, I'm curious if there's anything like that going on in Europe, or any kind of government-centered reputation system, identity system.
No, not yet. And I'm really glad we're not following the way China is doing.
Yeah,
it's really scary what they're doing. Especially also when you talk to because I talked to some Chinese people lately, and they really trust that this is really good for giving them access to loans. But they're only forgetting that it's a really interesting way of, by data and gamification, controlling the population of your country. So that's technically really interesting, but when you look at the human side, it's really a really bad thing. But no, in Europe I didn't see it, and I also don't think that the government needs to build a reputation system. I think maybe the government needs to facilitate with a platform that also connects to some government departments, like ID check, criminal background check, and then offers this as a kind of a tool and platform with APIs, and then other parties can tap into. Because I don't think the government needs to build the whole system, and this has nothing to do with my distrust in government and IT. But I think it's just not the best solution. So I think the government can build a kind of a platform that taps into the government system at some ways. So like with the criminal background and the ID check, maybe also the registration of who lives where in which house, also for Airbnb, really easy. But then also leaves it open for other stakeholders in the markets to tap into.
Well, it's interesting here. Is we've been doing a lot with the future of the platform economy. I mean, this project originally started the future of the sharing economy, but clearly sharing economy is built on these platforms, and the platforms are bigger than the sharing economy, and they are really essentially driving the modern economy right now, including the media-oriented ones that you don't categorize as sharing economy, which is true. Google, Facebook, Amazon, all these others. And there's a lot of fear, particularly in Europe, about the scale of these global companies and the network effect that kind of advantages a kind of early position in those platforms. But what's interesting is you're kind of talking about trends recently here that are counter to that fear, or at least potentially could undermine that fear, or help placate that fear, I guess is one way to think of it. Because you're saying there's actually technologies coming along that will allow other kinds of ways to transact at lower and lower costs in localized areas that would allow, which would essentially be competitive with these global giants. Is that true? Is that your kind of way of thinking about the situation right now?
Yeah, definitely. I would see it as a possible option. So it's not the fact, but it's an option. But I think it will take about 2 or 3 years before we are ready for this, because I think we can, or people can build more decentralized solutions where also some public values are also incorporated, because these are things we don't see at the big platforms. But the only problem is, if you want to have a kind of a more level playing field. So what's now happening is, especially in gig economy, the platform, they're investing a lot in getting customers. So there are, like Uber last year, $2.6 billion in 1 year. So they're sponsoring many rides. So, and this is something that's as a alternative decentral platform you can never compete with, because you can make the system fair, but you can't sponsor the rides. also these questions about, okay, are the workers in the gig economy treated equal? Because if you are only giving them less money, then also for the more fair platform, then they will be more expensive. So we need to wait till the regulation is there, so there will be a more equal and level playing fields also for the labor standards, for example, and also before the venture capitalists will lost their trust in getting a maximum revenue out of the investments and stop sponsoring the taxi rides of Uber. Because before that, you have no chance, whatever you do, because in the end, we human beings, you and me, we're lazy, and we only go for convenience and for the best price. The same like with meat. There's quite some discussion in the Netherlands about chicken meats, and you have the bad chicken meats and cheap, and the good chicken meats expensive. We all know this chicken had a much better life and is much better for our planets. But in the end, when we're in supermarkets, we'll buy this one. So the fairness in a model might never be a handicap in the system. So if you are going to build an alternative, it can never be a less good experience than the other alternative. So I think that's why it will take 2 or 3 years before these kind of developments really can grow. But in the meantime, we can experiment so we can learn.
And you're saying ultimately over those 2 or 3 years, regulation or government has to somehow even the playing field. But it seems like given these past examples, there's ways to do that. People have done it. It's worked before. There's no reason to think we can't work these things out ultimately.
No, and also because now in the US, the gig economy is much further than in Europe. But the interesting, if you see the development crowdfunding, sharing economy, gig economy, then you could already knew from day one here in the crowdfunding that the gig economy would have the biggest impact on society, because how more dependent you are as an individual of the platform, how bigger the impact is in your life and society when the model isn't fair. And this is also what we're now starting to realize. Just starting to realize in the Netherlands with Deliveroo. It's Uber Eats, but then from the UK, and there's quite some discussion about that. Because the impact of lives of people is much bigger than when you're renting out your car 2 times a month by using Snapcar.
Interesting. So your evolution which was your personal evolution, but also what you see as the evolution from crowdfunding, which is if you can raise money, you can raise money, and if not, it's not going to change your life, to kind of the sharing economy, which is essentially more efficiently using common physical goods, which does impact your life but doesn't change it dramatically. And you're saying the gig economy, though, is getting into the fabric of day-to-day work, fundamental kind of income, and that level, it does have a huge impact. So we're seeing an increasing kind of focus of essentially government regulation, but also just societal impact, which brings kind of governmental impact. Is that the way you kind of see it? It sounds like?
Yeah, definitely.
And so from your point of view, because we're getting towards the end of our conversation here, you've laid out a lot of developments here. You seem to show a very healthy and pretty steady improvement and refinement in how these platforms are enmeshing and kind of getting interconnected in our society. Is that accurate to say that you seem pretty positive about how that's evolved? I mean, there's been ups and downs, but in general, there's been a pretty interesting progression there. I'm curious, is that how you term it?
I think there's quite some positive side, especially when you look at crowdfunding and sharing economy. I think with gig economy, there are quite some problems because because the way the gig economy works, so it's really gigs, it's low skills, low labor. Everybody almost can do it. You don't build up your own client agenda. So the gig economy platforms, they are really good in making workers really dependent on the platforms. So I see the biggest challenge now in the gig economy platforms. I really believe that sharing economy crowdfunding, they will do right. So I'm really positive about that. But the gig economy is still something that I worry quite a lot about because the impacts on society and lives is really big, but also the almost perfect technical way that platforms can make people dependent and lock in and control so the algorithm is your boss. These are things that we really need to think more about.
And do you feel that's interesting? So that would require more, again, societal intervention, which kind of tends to be government regulation. Do you think that's the kind of answer somehow, or more competition in that space, or what are the answers there essentially?
I think regulation is one thing. What the platform economy does, it's lowers thresholds. So markets that were really small and fragmented in the past can now potentially grow really fast. So markets, because platforms, the activities, they're not new. They were there for ages. But because it was so small and so fragmented, the government never needed to have an opinion on it because it was just so small. So there was no sense of urgency to think about it, to think about regulation, about taxation. But now, because the platforms, they are lowering the thresholds, and because they potentially can scale this activity, this makes that activities that were used to active in more gray areas are now growing really fast, and that's really starts to and it really creates the sense of urgency for government to think about regulation. But there's also a positive side, because in the end it's not all negative. Because like when you see at the cleaning markets, the cleaning market is traditionally a black market. So tax services have no idea what's happening over there. So what platforms can do is make black markets to more into the legal into the legal fields. So there are quite some possibilities for that. So I think we also need to have the discussion also case by case. So because like in the Netherlands, there are about 160 sharing and gig platforms active.
How many you said? 160?
Yes.
160 sharing gigs.
We're only talking about Uber and Airbnb. So there are also 158 others with complete different value propositions, with complete different founders, with complete different ambitions. So it's also a discussion really interesting to talk about the big players, because then the impact is the biggest, and they're also really interesting because of what they do and what they don't do. But we don't need to forget that there are also a other layer of smaller platforms with complete different discussions.
And so it's not like a local home sharing platform that isn't one of those 158. You're saying that they're taking on whole different markets, cleaning markets, whatever it is, different things, and bringing that into the platform world. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, there are about 10 sectors, because I'm also running a platform in Dutch that gives an overview of the Dutch sharing economy landscape. And so I put all these 160 different platforms into 10 categories. So that's how you can see the market. And some platforms...
What are they? Just give us an example. Give us, what are the 10 categories? I'm curious.
Let me see. So that's services, knowledge, energy, goods, logistic, mobility, space, food, healthcare, and the ecosystem.
That's fascinating. And each of those has a little ecosystem of competing companies and everything else in that space.
Yes, and it's also interesting to see how different companies. So some companies, they really have big growth ambitions, and some they say, okay, I just think I want to keep it small. Because also the problem with many platforms who are growing really fast, because when a platform is really small, like especially more local initiatives, there are many hidden costs of the volunteers. At the moment when you scale, you need to hire somebody to do the work, and then the model will fall apart. So I think, and it's also something that's a new workflow. I saw you also interviewed him of Shareable. Also, that we don't need to, we really need to find ways not to scale platforms, but how to replicate platforms, because especially platforms who have a really big social impact, they throw away the social impacts when they want to scale to survive.
Right.
So that's my experience here with the Dutch platform. So we really need to find ways how to lower thresholds, and how we then can replicate the models instead of growing.
That's fascinating. These 10 categories, are they in English or Dutch? Through the web, actually, or is it a localized? It's a localized thing in your local language.
It's a Dutch website, so they're also most of them, they are Dutch platforms. But I can share a English version of the infographic with you.
That'd be good. Okay, well, final question, because we're kind of at the end of our time here. But so you've been talking about relatively positively. You've been very frank about challenges and things where it's not going right and where more has to be done. But when you look at those next 3 to 5 years, are you bullish on this space? Are you optimistic about where it's going? Are you worried? Or tell me how you feel about the coming years here.
I think that we will get there in, let's say, 5 years. The only thing that I'm worried about is that because we are learning by doing, is that damage that we are creating for individual lives in these 5 years. Because we're all experimenting to find out the models where all the stakeholders get the right value out of. But before we're there will probably also quite some damage to be done. So that's the...
Well, but when you say there, what is there meaning? Meaning getting a robust, well-regulated, efficient sharing economy that works all kinds of different levels of society. Is that kind of you're there?
Yeah, definitely. And there are different options if it will be a more central model or a more decentral model. That depends on how the things we think about now will work in practice. But I think in the end, it will work out. But we really need to be really critical on the things that are happening right now, especially with the discussion we have here in Europe about the power of the big platforms, the data power, and also the ways many platforms operate from the start by just ignoring regulation. But there's also something about this disruptive, because we're all saying, oh, these platforms, they're disruptive. But I really believe disruptive is only there for 2 years, because you can't stay disruptive for 10 years. Mm-hmm. So I think many companies, they started as being disruptive to create a blurry landscape in which they can ignore regulation and grow really fast. But in the end, they need to adapt to the society, because in the end, also platform economy is economy. So in the end, platforms need to find a place in the economy and society. And it's also what you see happening with Airbnb in Amsterdam. In the beginning, they made agreements, but they didn't do anything besides that. And year by year, they started to work together more and more with local governments. Because, in the end, of course, they are trying to slow down the process. I would do the same if I was the entrepreneur behind Airbnb. But in the end, you can't be disruptive for 10 years. In the end, you need to grow up and be just part of the economy.
And in that case, they've done that or are doing that, and you anticipate that'll be, for the larger sharing economy, is what's kind of rolling out here in the coming years. Is that accurate? Yeah,
because you can't ignore all the discussion. Also now discussion on gig economy platforms in the Netherlands. There are many stakeholders they are now involved in the discussion. And you can't just say, okay, I'm not listening and I'm just going straight on, because then in the end, the sentiment will also change. The same what we also saw with Uber in the Netherlands. First it was really positive, and then there was a tipping point. And from there, people said, okay, but now you need to grow up. Now you need to pay taxes, and else you're not welcome in our country.
Fascinating. Well, it's been great talking to you, and unfortunately we're at the end of our time here, but thanks so much, and opening up the world of the nuances of all the European space and how that's really helping figure out the future of the sharing economy. So thanks for being with us.
Welcome.